Imagine a land where ancient civilizations thrived long before anyone ever called it America, a place where freedom and oppression, hope and cruelty walked hand in hand, from the first footsteps of native nations to the bold revolutions that reshaped the world, to the struggles that still define us today. This is not just history. It's the story of a nation born from contradiction, tested by fire, and still writing its future. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see the United States forever. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. Before there was a nation, there was a land vast enough to humble the human imagination. Rivers older than memory carved their way through forests and plains. Mountains rose like unfinished sentences, daring anyone to complete them. For thousands of years, this land was already alive with meaning. Native nations, Haudenosaunee, Cherokee, Lakota, Pueblo, and hundreds more, built civilizations, governed themselves, traded, worshipped, and told stories that bound the earth to the heavens. America did not begin with discovery. It began with presence. And from the very start, its history would be shaped by a tragic contradiction, a land of promise built on dispossession. When Europeans arrived, they came with crosses and crowns, maps and muskets. They brought ambition wrapped in faith and disease carried unknowingly in their breath. Spain claimed France explored, Britain settled. Jamestown clung to survival in 1607, a fragile outpost where hunger taught harsh lessons about cooperation and cruelty. Plymouth followed, fueled by belief and fear, seeking freedom for themselves while denying it to others. From the beginning, the American story carried a tension that never left it: the pursuit of liberty alongside the practice of domination. The colonies grew, not gently but aggressively. Forests fell, farms expanded. Enslaved Africans were dragged across the Atlantic in chains, their lives reduced to property, their suffering woven into the economic foundation of the New World. Slavery was not a footnote to American history, it was a cornerstone. The wealth of ports, the rise of plantations, the comfort of colonial life, all rested on stolen labor and stolen lives. Even as colonists spoke of rights, they denied the humanity of millions. By the mid-18th century, the colonies had matured, and so had their grievances. Taxes without representation, distant kings, and imperial arrogance ignited something combustible. Words became weapons. Pamphlets spread like wildfire. Ordinary people, farmers, printers, merchants, began to believe an extraordinary idea that power belonged not to bloodlines, but to the people. In 1776, that belief was set down in ink, daring the world to hold it accountable. All men are created equal, the Declaration proclaimed, even as enslaved men and women listened from the shadows, knowing those words did not yet include them. The American Revolution was not a clean triumph of good over evil. It was messy, uncertain, and deeply human. Neighbors chose sides. Families fractured. Soldiers marched barefoot and afraid. Victory was not inevitable, but when it came, it carried with it a radical experiment. A republic built not on a king, but on an idea. The Constitution followed, a document both brilliant and flawed, balancing liberty with compromise, freedom with fear. It protected slavery to preserve union, planting a moral debt that would come due. As the nation pushed westward, it spoke of destiny. The frontier was framed as opportunity, but it was also conquest. Native tribes were forced from ancestral lands through treaties broken as soon as they were signed. The trail of tears etched sorrow across the continent, a reminder that progress, when unrestrained by conscience, can become cruelty. Yet Americans continued to believe in the promise of tomorrow, convinced that the horizon held redemption. The 19th century tested that faith. Cotton fueled prosperity in the South and dependence in the North. Abolitionists raised their voices, some whispering, some shouting, insisting that a nation dedicated to liberty could not survive half enslaved and half free. The argument moved from words to bullets. The Civil War tore the country apart. Brother against brother ideology against identity. It was the bloodiest chapter in American history, and its cost was measured not only in lives lost, but in illusions destroyed. When the war ended, slavery died with it on paper. Emancipation promised a new birth of freedom, but Reconstruction was brief and fragile. Hope flickered, then faded. Black Americans faced terror, segregation, and systemic exclusion, even as the nation congratulated itself on reunion. The wound of the war healed unevenly, leaving scars that would ache for generations. As the 20th century dawned, America emerged as an industrial power. Cities swelled with immigrants chasing the same dream that had drawn settlers centuries earlier. Factories roared, fortunes were made, inequality deepened, child labor, tenement housing, and crushing poverty exposed the cost of unchecked capitalism. Reformers pushed back, demanding that democracy mean more than survival. Progress came slowly, unevenly, but it came. 2 world wars pulled the United States onto the global stage. In Europe and the Pacific, American soldiers fought tyranny abroad while contradictions festered at home. Japanese Americans were imprisoned by their own government. African American soldiers returned from victory overseas to discrimination at home. Yet the wars also forged a sense of shared purpose, proving that America's strength lay not just in weapons, but in collective resolve. The Cold War followed, an age of fear and ambition. America cast itself as a defender of freed, while wrestling with paranoia and power. McCarthyism silenced dissent. Nuclear weapons threatened annihilation. At the same time, voices long ignored grew impossible to silence. The civil rights movement rose not from comfort, but from courage. Ordinary people, students, ministers, mothers, stood unarmed against dogs, fire hoses, and hatred, forcing the nation to confront its own words. Laws changed. Hearts followed more slowly. The late 20th century brought triumph and turmoil. The moon landing testified to human ingenuity. Vietnam exposed the limits of power. Watergate shattered trust. Women demanded equality. LGBTQ Americans claimed visibility. The nation expanded its definition of we bar bar, even as debates grew sharper, louder, more personal. Then came a new century, marked by terror and technology. September 11, 2001, reopened the vocabulary of fear, unity, and sacrifice. Wars followed. So did questions about security and freedom. The internet reshaped truth itself, amplifying voices and divisions alike. Progress and polarization advanced side by side. Today, the United States remains unfinished. It is still wrestling with its past, still arguing over its future. It is a nation born in idealism and scarred by injustice, capable of both cruelty and compassion. Its history is not a straight line toward greatness, but a constant negotiation between who Americans are and who they claim to be. The story of the United States is not the story of perfection. It is the story of striving, of people who believed the promise was worth the pain, of generations who challenged the nation to live up to its own words. America has never been a destination. It has always been a question asked again and again by each generation in moments of crisis and hope alike. Can a nation built on an idea continue to choose its better angels? Long before the word America was ever spoken, long before maps tried to tame the continent with lines and names, this land already knew itself. It breathed through forests that stretched beyond sight, through rivers that moved with a patience older than memory, through plains where the sky felt close enough to touch. Human life here was not an interruption of nature, but a conversation with it. Native nations lived within systems of meaning refined over thousands of years, shaping societies that understood balance, responsibility, and belonging. The Haudenosaunee governed through councils and consensus, valuing unity over domination. The Pueblo built cities of stone and earth that rose naturally from the desert itself. The Lakota followed the rhythms of the buffalo, binding survival to respect. This was not emptiness waiting to be filled. It was presence, rich and layered, already complete in its own way. History, however, would not remember it that way. When Europeans crossed the Atlantic, they did not arrive at a beginning, but at a meeting, though they rarely understood it as such. They came carrying their own stories of scarcity and salvation, their own hierarchies and fears. To them, land was something to be claimed, measured, owned. They spoke of discovery as though existence required permission. What followed was not a single moment of conquest, but a slow collision between worlds that could not easily recognize one another. Disease moved faster than armies, hollowing out entire communities before treaties could even be broken. What guns and steel finished, illness had already begun. Survival itself became resistance. The earliest encounters were marked by misunderstanding layered with ambition. Trade occurred alongside violence. Alliances formed and collapsed. Europeans depended on native knowledge to live through unfamiliar winters, to grow food from unfamiliar soil, even as they planned settlements that would push those same people aside. Gratitude and betrayal often shared the same breath. The land once shared through tradition and memory, was now fenced by documents written in foreign languages, enforced by distant kings who would never see the forests they claimed to own. As colonies took root, they did so precariously. Jamestown was less a symbol of destiny than of desperation. Starvation stalked the settlement, and survival demanded brutal choices. Power quickly concentrated in the hands of a few, and violence became a tool of order. Plymouth followed with a different story, one shaped by faith and persecution, by the desire to worship freely. Yet freedom was imagined narrowly, reserved for those who looked and believed the same. Community was built through exclusion as much as shared belief. From the beginning, the idea of liberty carried borders. The land absorbed these contradictions quietly. Trees were cut, fields planted, towns established. As the colonies expanded, the labor that sustained them increasingly came from Africa, forced across the ocean in conditions so cruel that survival itself was an act of defiance. Enslaved men, women, and children were stripped of names, languages, and families, yet they carried memory in song, rhythm, and prayer. Their presence reshaped America just as profoundly as any European tradition, though their humanity was systematically denied. The nation that would later speak so eloquently about freedom learned early how to look away from suffering it found inconvenient. For Native peoples, the expansion of colonial life meant constant displacement. Treaties promised peace, then dissolved under pressure of profit and population. Lands held sacred were reduced to acreage, their value measured only in what could be extracted. Resistance took many forms: armed conflict, negotiation, retreat, adaptation, but the outcome was repeatedly the same. Each generation was pushed further from its center, told again and again that survival required disappearance. Yet culture endured, stories passed quietly, languages whispered into children's ears even when punishment followed. By the time the colonies began to imagine themselves something separate from Europe, the land itself had already been transformed by centuries of struggle. Forests bore the marks of axes. Rivers carried the refuse of settlements. Paths once traveled by native traders became roads for wagons and troops. The soil was rich with harvest and blood alike. The idea of America was emerging not as a blank promise, but as a layered inheritance of choices already made. What defined this early America was not innocence, but adaptation. People learned to endure harsh climates, unfamiliar dangers, and one another. They built systems to justify inequality and narratives to explain conquest. They also built communities, families, and hopes that felt genuine and urgent. The contradiction lived everywhere, in churches that preached salvation while blessing chains, in laws that spoke of rights while denying personhood, in a society that depended on both cooperation and cruelty. The myth of discovery would later smooth these edges, turning complexity into simplicity, violence into inevitability. But history, when listened to closely, refuses to be so tidy. It tells of choices made by ordinary people who could not see the future, only the immediate demands of survival and ambition. It tells of civilizations that did not vanish but were pushed to the margins, forced to watch as their world was renamed and reimagined without consent. America's beginning, then, was not a single moment of arrival, but a prolonged reckoning. A land already alive was forced into a new story, one written over existing truths rather than alongside them. The promise that would later define the nation was born not in purity, but in conflict, shaped by the tension between coexistence and conquest, between survival and domination, between the belief that this land could belong to everyone and the reality that it was taken from those who were here first. As the colonies grew more confident, more populous, and more restless, a dangerous idea began to take hold, one that would change the course of history not only for a continent, but for the world. It was the belief that authority did not flow downward from a distant crown, but upward from ordinary people, that legitimacy was earned through consent rather than inherited through blood. This idea did not emerge fully formed. It grew slowly, shaped by town meetings, sermons, pamphlets, and arguments held in taverns late into the night. It was debated by farmers and merchants, printers and preachers, men who had tasted just enough autonomy to resent its limits. The British Empire, powerful and confident after defeating its European rivals, saw the colonies as assets to be managed. Taxes were imposed, laws tightened, control asserted. From London, these measures seemed reasonable. From Boston, they felt suffocating. What angered the colonists most was not hardship alone, but humiliation, the sense of being ruled by people who neither knew their lives nor respected their voices. Resistance began as protest. Protest hardened into defiance, and defiance eventually became revolution. Words lit the fuse before weapons ever did. Essays argued that rights were not granted by governments, but were inherent, natural, beyond the reach of kings. Pamphlets circulated widely, radical in their simplicity. They spoke of equality, liberty, and self-rule with a moral certainty that left little room for compromise. When independence was finally declared, it was framed not merely as a political separation, but as a moral one. The language was bold, soaring, uncompromising. It claimed universal truths, asserting that all people were born equal and endowed with unalienable rights. And yet, even as those words ere written, their limitations were visible to anyone willing to look. Enslaved Africans labored within earshot of liberty's proclamation. Women were excluded from political voice. Native nations were treated as obstacles rather than equals. The ideals of the revolution were expansive, but their application was narrow. This was not hypocrisy born of ignorance. It was contradiction sustained by convenience. The same leaders who spoke passionately about freedom often owned human beings. The same society that rebelled against tyranny enforced it daily. The war itself revealed both the power and fragility of the revolutionary cause. It was fought by volunteers and conscripts, by idealists and the desperate. Soldiers endured hunger, cold, and fear, sustained less by certainty than by stubborn hope. Victory was never assured. The young nation survived as much through luck and foreign aid as through unity. When independence was finally secured, celebration mixed with exhaustion, and a new question emerged: how to turn an idea into a functioning country. The answer came in the form of a constitution drafted in secrecy, shaped by compromise. Its architects feared chaos as much as tyranny. They sought balance, checks, restraint. In doing so, they built a system flexible enough to endure and flawed enough to provoke conflict. Slavery was neither named nor abolished, instead protected indirectly through clauses that treated human beings as fractions and property. These compromises were justified as necessary, temporary, pragmatic, but history would reveal their cost. The early republic moved forward with confidence, convinced of its exceptionalism. Elections replaced kings. Peaceful transfers of power became precedents rather than miracles. To many white men, America already felt like the fulfillment of its promise. But beneath this progress lay deep injustice, normalized and enforced by law. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways through escape, rebellion, and quiet endurance. Their resistance challenged the nation's self-image, exposing the gap between what America said it believed and what it was willing to tolerate. Expansion intensified this contradiction. As new states joined the Union, the question of slavery followed them like a shadow. Each compromise postponed reckoning while deepening division. Freedom and bondage advanced together, entwined rather than opposed. Political leaders spoke of unity while calculating advantage. Moral clarity was repeatedly sacrificed to maintain balance. The nation survived, but at the cost of honesty. Even so, the revolutionary ideals refused to disappear. They were too powerful, too clearly stated to remain confined. Abolitionists seized upon them, arguing that a nation founded on equality could not indefinitely deny it. Enslaved people invoked the language of the founders to demand inclusion in its promises. Women drew on revolutionary rhetoric to challenge their exclusion. The words written in 1776 began to escape the intentions of those who wrote them, becoming tools of dissent rather than instruments of comfort. This tension defined the young United States. It was a country animated by noble principles and sustained by unjust systems, capable of inspiring hope while inflicting suffering. Its greatness lay not in moral purity, but in the durability of its ideals even when betrayed. The revolution created a framework that allowed for self-correction, but it did not guarantee it. Change would require struggle, sacrifice, and time. The founders imagined a republic that could endure human imperfection, but they underestimated the depth of the contradictions they embedded within it. The promise of liberty expanded faster than the willingness to honor it. Each generation inherited both the vision and the burden, tasked with deciding whether the nation's words were meant to be decorative or binding, whether equality was metaphor or mandate, whether freedom was a possession to be guarded or a responsibility to be extended. With independence secured and ideals declared, the young nation turned its gaze westward toward a horizon that seemed to promise renewal without limit. The land beyond the settled edges was spoken of as opportunity, as destiny, as a blank canvas waiting for ambition. This belief took hold not just as policy, but as faith, convincing generations that expansion was both natural and righteous. Yet this movement across the continent was never merely a story of company, courage, and ingenuity. It was also a story of erasure, of promises made and broken, of lives disrupted in the name of progress. Settlers moved west with wagons and hope, carrying families, tools, and dreams of ownership. For many, land meant independence, a chance to escape the rigid hierarchies of the East. The soil offered dignity through labor, the possibility of self-determination. Communities formed around shared hardship, and from that hardship came resilience, innovation, and a fierce attachment to place. Railroads stitched distant regions together. Towns rose where only trails had been. Industry followed agriculture, transforming raw materials into wealth and drawing immigrants who believed America still held room for them. But the land was not empty, and it never had been. Native nations stood in the path of expansion, and rather than being welcomed as neighbors or partners, they were treated as obstacles to be removed. Treaties were signed under pressure and violated with ease. When negotiation failed to clear the way quickly enough, force followed. Entire communities were uprooted, marched away from ancestral homelands toward unfamiliar and unforgiving territories. The journey itself became a weapon, draining strength, breaking spirits, leaving graves along the roads. What was called relocation was experienced as loss, not just of land, but of identity and continuity. The language of destiny softened the violence, turning conquest into inevitability. Expansion was framed as progress, resistance as backwardness. The nation told itself that growth required sacrifice, carefully avoiding the question of who was being asked to sacrifice and who was benefiting. Each mile westward carried both promise and grief, though only one was celebrated. The contradiction deepened as the country congratulated itself on opportunity while denying justice, as new territories became states. The unresolved issue of slavery followed closely behind. Expansion did not dilute the problem, it sharpened it. Each new region forced the nation to confront whether freedom would grow alongside its borders or whether bondage would spread with equal determination. Compromises were struck, lines drawn on maps as if morality could be contained by latitude. These temporary solutions postponed conflict while making it more explosive. Politics became a battleground of calculation, where human lives were weighed against power and stability. Economic growth accelerated these tensions. Cotton transformed the Southern economy into a global force, binding prosperity to enslavement. Northern industries depended on Southern raw materials, tying regions together in uneasy partnership. Wealth accumulated rapidly for some, while others lived in conditions barely distinguishable from survival. Immigration added complexity, filling cities with new languages and cultures, fueling factories and dreams, while also igniting fear and resentment. America was growing not only larger, but more divided. The frontier demanded toughness, and it cultivated a myth of self-reliance that still echoes. Individuals learned to depend on their own labor and judgment, to solve problems without waiting for distant authority. This independence became a source of pride, shaping national character, but it also masked the networks of support and exploitation that made expansion possible. From government land grants to military protection to the labor of those denied recognition. The myth simplified reality, turning collective effort into individual triumph. Violence became a constant companion to growth. Conflicts with native tribes, clashes over land claims, disputes fueled by race and religion marked the landscape. Law followed settlement, not the other way around, often arriving late and unevenly. Justice was inconsistent, shaped by power rather than principle. Yet even within this chaos, communities sought order. Schools were built. Churches gathered people together. Newspapers connected isolated towns to national debates. Culture took root alongside conflict. The moral contradictions of expansion did not go unnoticed. Voices rose in protest, warning that a nation founded on liberty could not indefinitely thrive on dispossession and bondage. Writers, ministers, and activists challenged the dominant narrative, insisting that progress without conscience was merely another form of tyranny. Their words unsettled the comfortable and emboldened the restless, widening the gap between America's ideals and its actions. As the country stretched from ocean to ocean, the cost of unresolved injustice became impossible to ignore. Expansion had magnified every fault line. Freedom and slavery, opportunity and oppression, democracy and exclusion now existed side by side on a continental scale. The nation had gained land, wealth, and power, but it had also accumulated debt, moral and human, that could not be paid quietly. The belief that growth alone could redeem contradiction began to falter as divisions hardened into identities. By the eve of national crisis, the United States stood immense and uneasy, its achievements undeniable, its conscience unsettled. The land had been transformed, reshaped by ambition and endurance, but the questions that haunted its beginning remained unanswered. Progress had delivered innovation and prosperity, but it had also delivered suffering and resentment, binding the future to a past that refused to stay buried, forcing a reckoning that expansion had delayed but never erased. When the nation finally broke under the weight of its own contradictions, it did not do so suddenly or by accident. The Civil War arrived after decades of avoidance, compromise, and moral delay, a storm long visible on the horizon but repeatedly ignored. By the time it came, Americans no longer argued merely about policy or economics, but about the meaning of the country itself. Whether the United States was a union held together by convenience or a moral bound by principle became a question that could no longer be postponed. The war fractured families, churches, and communities. Brothers wore opposing uniforms. Neighbors became enemies. The language of politics gave way to the language of survival. For those who fought, the cause was often less abstract than later generations would imagine. Soldiers marched because of loyalty, fear, duty, or desperation. They endured mud, hunger, disease, and terror with little certainty that their suffering would mean anything beyond the next sunrise. Ideals mattered, but survival mattered more in the moment. Yet beneath the chaos of battle lay a profound transformation. Enslaved people recognized the war for what it was, an opening. They fled plantations, crossed battle lines, offered labor and intelligence, and forced the issue of freedom into the center of the conflict. Their actions reshaped the war's purpose as much as any speech or proclamation. Emancipation did not descend from above as a gift. It rose from below as a demand paid for with courage and risk. When slavery was finally abolished, the nation stood at a crossroads unlike any it had known. The end of bondage promised a new definition of freedom, one that extended beyond the absence of chains toward participation in civic life. For a brief and fragile moment, Reconstruction offered a glimpse of what America might become. Black men voted and held office. Schools were built. Families reunited. Laws were written to protect civil rights and redefine citizenship. The Constitution was amended, expanding its moral reach, attempting to correct the compromises of its birth. But this moment was contested from the start. The same forces that had defended slavery now resisted equality with equal determination. Violence replaced debate. Terror enforced hierarchy. Organizations dedicated to intimidation flourished, often with the quiet tolerance of authorities. The federal government, exhausted by war and divided in will, retreated from its commitments. Reconstruction, ambitious and incomplete, collapsed under the weight of opposition and indifference. What followed was not peace, but a colder, quieter conflict. Segregation became law. Disenfranchisement became routine. The promise of freedom narrowed into survival once again. The nation told itself that the conflict was resolved, that unity had been restored, but the terms of that unity were deeply unequal. The wounds of the war healed unevenly, forming scars that hardened into systems. Memory itself became contested terrain, with narratives crafted to soften guilt and obscure responsibility. Even so, the amendments endured. The words remained, waiting. They carried within them the possibility of renewal, even when ignored. Black Americans built institutions where they could, churches, schools, businesses, sustaining dignity in the face of exclusion. Their perseverance kept alive the unfinished work of Reconstruction, preserving a moral claim the nation had failed to honor. The industrial age transformed the country again, drawing millions into cities, reshaping labor and wealth. Opportunity expanded alongside exploitation. New forms of inequality emerged, layered atop old ones. Reform movements rose to confront child labor, unsafe working conditions, and political corruption. Democracy stretched to include more voices, though always unevenly, always contested. The nation oscillated between progress and retrenchment, reform and resistance. By the mid-20th century, the contradictions inherited from the Civil War could no longer be contained. The language of equality embedded in the Constitution was reclaimed and amplified. The Civil Rights Movement did not invent new ideals. It demanded fidelity to old ones. Ordinary people challenged unjust laws through extraordinary courage, facing violence with discipline, hatred with resolve. Their struggle exposed the gap between American rhetoric and American reality, forcing the nation to watch itself in action. Legal victories followed, dismantling segregation and restoring voting rights. These changes reshaped public life, altering who could participate and be seen. But law could not instantly undo generations of injustice. Economic inequality persisted. Cultural resistance hardened. Progress inspired backlash, revealing how deeply the old order had been embedded. Freedom expanded, but it did not arrive equally for all. The legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction content. UD to shape national life in subtle and overt ways. Debates over federal power, states' rights, citizenship, and equality echoed the arguments of the 19th century. Symbols and monuments became battlegrounds over memory and meaning. The past refused to stay settled, intruding into the present whenever questions of justice arose. America emerged from these struggles altered but unfinished. The war had preserved the Union and ended slavery, but it had not resolved the deeper question of equality. Reconstruction had gestured toward a more inclusive democracy, then retreated. Each generation inherited both the achievements and the failures, tasked again with deciding whether freedom would be merely declared or fully defended, whether citizenship would be universal or conditional, whether the sacrifices of the past would be honored through action or reduced to ceremony. The story of the United States, long shaped by contradiction, did not end with the Civil War, nor with Reconstruction, nor with industrial growth. It is a story that continues, unfolding in the tension between promise and practice, a nation perpetually unfinished, perpetually striving. The 20th century brought new challenges and new opportunities, forcing Americans to confront the meaning of liberty in a rapidly changing world. Each decade demanded a renegotiation of ideals, a reimagining of who could be included, who could be trusted, and what it meant to be free in a country built on words as much as on land. Old wars drew the nation onto a global stage, testing both power and conscience. Soldiers marched into Europe and the Pacific, fighting for freedoms they could not fully claim at home. African Americans served abroad, experiencing societies with less rigid racial hierarchies, only to return to segregated streets and schools. Japanese Americans were confined to internment camps, proving that fear could override principle even in the heart of a democracy. These conflicts illuminated the persistent gap between America's ideals and its actions, challenging citizens to reconcile patriotism with critique. At the same time, domestic transformations reshaped the country. Cities swelled with immigrants seeking opportunity, while rural communities confronted mechanization and economic uncertainty. Industrialization brought unprecedented wealth, but also inequality, labor strife, and political corruption. Reformers emerged, insisting that democracy must extend beyond the ballot box to include economic fairness and social responsibility. Progress was never linear. It advanced unevenly, met with resistance at every turn, and often left marginalized communities bearing the heaviest burden of change. The mid-20th century demanded moral courage. The civil rights movement, emerging from decades of struggle, tested the nation's capacity for justice. Ordinary Americans, teachers, clergy, students, mothers stood unarmed against fire hoses, dogs, and hatred, insisting that the words of the Constitution be more than decoration. Marches, sit-ins, and speeches forced lawmakers to confront the contradiction of a nation claiming equality while tolerating systemic oppression. Gradually, laws changed. Voting rights were restored. Segregation was dismantled. Yet social attitudes evolved more slowly, demonstrating that legal reform is only one step toward actual justice. Simultaneously, women and other marginalized groups pressed for recognition and equality. The feminist movement challenged deeply ingrained social norms, demanding access to education, work, and political participation. LGBTQ Americans asserted their visibility, insisting that citizenship and dignity were rights, not privileges. Each struggle layered upon the others, gradually expanding the definition of who could claim the full promise of the United States. The nation's ideals, written centuries earlier, were now being tested in ways the founders could scarcely have imagined. The Cold War reshaped the country's priorities, juxtaposing democracy against communism and freedom against fear. Anti-communist hysteria, surveillance, and propaganda highlighted the tension between security and liberty. Yet the ERA also produced remarkable achievements: technological innovation, scientific exploration, and global influence. The space race culminated in the moon landing, a testament to human ingenuity and collective ambition. America's reach grew, and with it, both its confidence and its responsibility, demonstrating that power without conscience is incomplete. The turn of the 21st century introduced new challenges, unimagined by previous generations. The attacks of September 11, 2001, reopened the vocabulary of fear and sacrifice, thrusting the nation into conflicts abroad and debates at home. Technology transformed communication, information, and community, creating opportunities for connection while also amplifying division and disinformation. In this era, the promise of liberty collided with the complexity of governance. As Americans wrestled with the balance between freedom, security, and equality, throughout these changes, one constant remains: the nation continues to define itself not by what it has achieved, but by the questions it asks of itself. What does it mean to be free? Who is included in the promise? How can a democracy endure in the face of inequality, injustice, and human imperfection? Each generation answers differently, building upon triumphs and failures of the past. The United States has never been a finished project, and that incompleteness is itself a source of vitality. It is what allows reform, reinvention, and hope to remain possible. The nation's history is a testament to the interplay of courage and contradiction. Ordinary people, through both heroism and stubbornness, have propelled it forward. Movements for justice and equality have forced change even when institutions resisted. Innovations in science, technology, and culture have expanded what is possible, while crises and conflicts have tested resilience. The United States is at once proud and flawed, aspirational and troubled, powerful and humble in its moral ambitions. Even today, the questions remain urgent. Debates over equity, democracy, climate, immigration, and identity are continuations of struggles that have defined the nation for centuries. The ideals of the revolution, the promises of Reconstruction, the moral courage of the civil rights movement, all continue to inform the present. Citizens confront daily decisions that shape the character of the country, carrying the weight of history while imagining the possibilities of the future. The story of the United States is thus neither linear nor inevitable. It is an experiment in self-government, in moral aspiration, and in collective imagination. Its achievements are remarkable, yet inseparable from failure. Its ideals are profound, yet constantly tested. Its promise is real, but only to the extent that each generation chooses to honor it. The nation endures because it remains unfinished, because it continues to demand engagement, reflection, and courage from all who claim it as their own. America's strength has always lain not in perfection, but in perseverance, in the willingness of its people to question themselves, to challenge injustice, and to strive toward a more inclusive understanding of freedom. Each moment of progress has been hard-won, a victory of conscience over convenience, vision over complacency, and each setback has been a reminder that liberty is fragile, that equality is contested, and that democracy is never guaranteed but must be continuously defended. The United States remains, in essence, a work in progress, defined by both what it has been and what it aspires to become. It is a nation built on ideals that are at once timeless and incomplete, a country whose history is a living dialogue between promise and practice, between vision and reality, between the better angels it calls forth and the darker impulses it resists. Every citizen, in participating, in witnessing, in demanding, becomes part of this ongoing story, contributing to the perpetual task of turning words into deeds, ideals into realities, and aspiration into action. Thanks for watching this video, and Don T, forget to like and subscribe.